On the Majority Report on the phone, it is a pleasure to welcome to the program producer with Fork Films and author of It Was All a Dream, A New Generation Confronts the Broken Promise to Black America. Reniqua Allen, welcome to the program.
Good to be here, Sam.
So let's start with why. Why did you set out to write this book, which was, I guess, basically an examination in many respects of the millennials, Black millennials' response to, I think, well, you'll tell us from your perspective, but a perpetual frustration that Black people have in this country.
Absolutely. I saw stories of the Millennial Generation, which, as you may know, is not doing too well overall. There are lots of stories, particularly about kind of these urban elite, overeducated, entitled folks. But what I felt was missing from the conversation was actually a story about people of color, and particularly young Black people like myself. I saw my story feeling a little bit different. Yeah, absolutely, like kind of a millennial story. But race makes everything look a little bit different. I felt like things like, discrimination and racism and the burdens that carry was being missed on the story of the millennial. So I wanted to change that and talk to people, and not just myself, because I get tired of listening to myself, but I wanted to talk to other people and hear what they were going through too, and the things that they were experiencing. So that's why I started to write the book.
And you ended up interviewing about 75 people across the country. Tell us how you found them.
Yeah, in a range of ways. Some of the stories about millennials are out there. So there were a few that I were interested in, but I kind of looked at what the traditional notions of success were in America, what opportunity looked like, and then started kind of, then the things are pretty common: housing, education, student debt, and reached out to some organizations as I talked more to people about this book. Some people contacted me with friends or families. Some stories I found in newspaper articles. So really a range of ways that I reached out to people and decided who I wanted to profile.
And the title of the book, "It Was All a Dream," comes from a Biggie Smalls song. Why that title? I mean, at what point did that title come in for you, I guess?
I think the title was actually where I started. I mean, I knew I wanted to talk about opportunity in Black America, and I wanted to talk about opportunity in young Black America. And somehow, initially the conversations were about the American dream and what that meant. And I think I was just listening to the music. I listened to a lot of music, and the title, the song Juicy came up, and this idea, this notion of dreams was really in my mind, and it kind of came from there pretty organically. But I mean, I was also interested in how the notion of the dream in the Black community, obviously thinking about Martin Luther King's dream, and how that has kind of changed and morphed for different generations, and how, I think Biggie's song is actually a play on MLK's MLK's speech, and how even Jay-Z, even after Biggie died, kind of said, was it all a dream? And how we're kind of, I think, as a Black community, constantly thinking about dreams and promises, and really systematically, I think, being denied it, not just systematically, but culturally as well, being denied these dreams and promises, and what that meant to us.
Has that? I mean, because Juicy is optimistic, I think, as a song, right? I mean, and so has the perspective, or I guess let me ask you this from and then I want to get into maybe some of the individuals, but I'm curious as to what. Let's start with overall what your experience is of Black millennials what their response, what their perspective is on the American dream, how you might imagine it's different from white millennials in terms of what they experience, um, and and then I want to talk about maybe how that relationship to the American dream has changed, or if it has changed at all in earlier Black generations.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the most surprising statistics I found pretty early on when it relates to the American dream was that Black millennials, more than anyone in this generational cohort, actually believe in the American dream the most. Now, when you look at the studies, it's actually young white people who say that they've achieved it the most, but young Black people actually believed in it. They're optimistic. I think we are optimistic as a people, and I think that partially because we have like no other choice to be but optimistic. I think America's been pretty crappy to Black people. To be young in Black America doesn't always feel safe. I mean, there's a group of young women in New York State that just was searched, for their clothes. We see countless video after video of young Black men and women being brutalized, terrorized, and even killed by law enforcement. We know that it's not always safe place to be. America's not always a safe place to be. However, I say that with a caveat because I do think there's a lot of joy, there's a lot of optimism. There was high political rates of participation, political participation in the Black community. So I think that like these are all really wonderful things, and I say that, but also I think that there's still a desire to be seen as human, to be not seen as a burden or a problem. And I think that every single Black millennial I talk to, despite sexuality or political affiliation, or class position, said that their race impacted their lives. I think that matters, and I think when you look at white millennials, for example, and I should say Black and millennials of color doesn't necessarily mean they have equal experiences, but particularly when you look at white millennials, I think that sometimes they don't have to worry about those things. They don't have to worry about things like, am I going to get home safely? Now, they're worried and equally as burdened, I think, by some of the things that the millennial generation overall faces, like, student debt, for example, or, home ownership. But I think that because they don't have to contend with some of the other forces like racism and discrimination, their dreams are, a little bit different. I think that for Black millennials, they still want to they want to be visible. They want, we're the only group that has had to say our lives mattered, and that's a pretty significant thing for me, what that does to a person. Having a Black president, people don't necessarily think cured issues around race or racism. So it's a unique space to be, but at the same time, I think a lot of our dreams, the fundamental dreams, still center around, home ownership, housing, but we also want to be free. And I think that we don't necessarily think that. White millennials don't have to worry about that.
Where do you think it lies? I mean, and I think like you write about buying a house, and I guess in 2005, and subsequent to that, finding that you were eligible for participation in a class action because the mortgage, your lender was involved in predatory practices, and I think the idea that Black Americans were targeted more with these predatory practices is a function of there being, in addition to there being sort of broadly speaking less wealth in the Black community because less opportunity to develop wealth over time, but also less opportunities to borrow, and so going in and getting a supposed subprime loan, or at least those type of terms, when you maybe you didn't need to actually, had you been white, or had not been sort of cajoled into this. I'm not saying you specifically. I'm talking about the
Yeah.
community. But what I wonder, like, what to the extent that we're talking about Black Lives Matter, and to what extent is the relationship between these fears, are they being, is the difference for millennials that there is a theoretically a greater awareness, broad-based awareness of what Black Americans go through in terms of, particularly in the context of police and this concept, because of just like video cameras? I mean, within the Black community, right? I am, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine there's been, Gen X, baby boomers. They were all, those generations were all aware that, like, look, you're going to get treated differently. You're telling your kids you're going to get treated differently. You got to be careful out there. I imagine that's not new. The newness is that there's almost, there's an ability to show it to a broader audience.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. However, I'll say that I think that in the millennial generation, really, and in the next generation, Gen Z will see it too, we had to do this with the understanding that we were in the kind of shadow of the civil rights movement, right? Jesse Jackson had run for president. We saw Barack Obama. Most millennials came of age as Barack Obama was elected, to the White House, I think. And we are the most diverse adult generation now. Gen Z just took us over, I think, for being the most diverse population. But we are the most diverse adult population. I think that so many of us, or a lot of us, grew up even seeing, with white or partners of other colors. Schools are largely segregated now, but, a lot of us have had friends of other colors and other races. There are lots of Black representation on television. Right? Oprah was coming to dominate as we were growing up. So I think that there is this message that, well, if Issa Rae can do it, so can you. If Barack Obama can do it, you guys just work harder. But there aren't, there aren't limitations. I mean, even Donald Trump, and this was, I think, the 90s, said that he'd want to be a well-educated Black because they have lots of opportunities. So there's this language of opportunity is out there, and race doesn't matter. Right when Obama was, after he was elected, there's all this talk of like a post-racial America. So there's not, and I should say, even, I'm not sure if you've read it, but even as recently as, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, there was an article in out of a Boston outlet that said MLK's dream of race has largely, been achieved, which is like, what? So I think that, we have it a bit, it's a different place. It's essentially the same story, but I think we grew up in a different place than Gen X and definitely the baby boomers. So that makes our experiences unique. I don't want to say better or worse, but unique.
I mean, I just want to tease that out a little bit more. Like, what is it? Is it more complicated in some ways, in that it's not as, if you're fighting for the right to vote, you're fighting for the right to not be discriminated when you go into a restaurant. If you're fighting for the right to not be discriminated when housing, it's a fairly binary, straightforward thing. But if if you ostensibly have those rights, but the options are limited, and in the context of a generation like the millennials, where they don't have the same opportunities that we did in Gen X, and those people who are who have the least political power, broadly speaking, who are subject to racism, are going to be even more impacted by the dynamics that are impacting the millennials broadly speaking. Is that in some ways? I mean, I don't, it's not a competition, but and I can tell that it's, obviously it's unique, but I'm curious as to that dynamic. That is sort of the problems are more subtle in some respects than, somebody turning a fire hose on you.
Right, right. Yeah, that's like I find the frustration of this generation. Now there are lots of things that aren't so subtle, right? Like, we are seeing black and brown men gunned down on cell
Right.
phones, right? That is not subtle. We see the language that's used even around, well, sometimes the language can be their dog whistles, right? Sometimes that can be subtle and not so subtle. But I absolutely think that, and from the millennials that I spoke with, said that that was the most frustrating part about this generation, about feeling less than, but having to prove that you experience some kind of racism in a way that, people want you to say, well, did someone call you the N-word? Because that to people proves that racism still exists. But what I think is harder for people is for someone to say, oh, here's this mediocre woman who just got promoted over me, and I think it's race, but I can't quite tell. I'm not sure, or I don't, or someone saying, a friend of mine who's a C student, has a great job. Her dad is, a VP of a company. That's why, she had this network, but, I didn't have that. And people seeing that as, a problem of race, and things like affirmative action not being advocated for as much. Someone, being asked for the ID at a polling place, is it race, is it not? Like, I feel like a lot of young millennials are kind of playing this game and don't always know how to deal with that, but still ultimately feeling that they are less than, that their lives actually are, worth less, that they aren't seen as equal. And that's a frustrating place to be in.
To what extent, in your experience, are black millennials sensitive to race? I mean, excuse me, to class.
Yeah.
Because I mean, it's interesting dynamic, and I think we're going to see it, play out, more and more in these elections, because the African American vote was the older vote seemed to go, at least within the context of like the Democratic primary, anyways, seemed to go with Clinton. Younger votes seemed to go with Sanders. We're going to get another opportunity, I think, in some respects during this primary to see how that shakes out. I'm curious, what was there? Where does class figure in with black millennials?
Oh, that's a great question. I think class is absolutely it's huge. I have two chapters, one specifically focused on Black professionals and one focused on working class millennials. And it plays a huge role in their lives. I actually found that much like Ellis Coast did a study on Black middle class folks in the 90s, and he said that it was a rage of a privileged class. And I found the most actually frustration, I think, with middle class or upper income Black millennials. And I think it's because, and this is kind of the same conclusion that Coase came to earlier on, that they have more of a proximity to white people. They are in corporate spaces more. They feel like they're tested by the system, quote unquote, even more so. And they were frustrated, by all means. Every single person I spoke with for this chapter in this group had made it. They were professional, but they felt like they were always questioned, and they felt like twice as hard was a very, very real thing for them that they experienced every single day. And it was a real, I would say, even burden on their lives. And it also impacted their lives in other ways that were interesting to me. Like, I started a lot of reporting for this book during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, and they felt that as Black professionals, they sometimes couldn't even protest or speak out in the ways that some of their counterparts could. So that impacted the way in their decisions on how to be vocal. Um, so that was also interesting, and a lot of them thought of the class divide because they thought that they had more on the line. But so that was really interesting, and yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I'm curious. I mean, if I understand what you're saying, that there was the wealthier and I guess in terms of compensation or in terms of making money, the more successful folks you spoke to, they more acutely felt the impact of their race. Is that what you're saying?
I think they felt that I think they felt it in the context of the workplace more because often these were folks who were the only one or one of a few. They felt directly that they had to kind of deal with this microaggressions every day. And I think more than any other group, they struggled with kind of, as you mentioned earlier, what is this subtle racial innuendo? How do I deal with that, and what are the consequences and repercussions for that?
That's interesting. And why is that? Just simply because they're in the world in which they work in is just more white,
Yes,
and they're being judged constantly by white people.
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it kind of goes across industry, right? Largely, white folks are the ones in power, whatever you're generally talking about, but particularly in these corporate spaces, in these professional environments, they didn't feel like, even the ones with good positions with, a lot of power still didn't feel like they had the autonomy. They still didn't feel like they had the freedom, so to speak, as their white counterparts to just kind of be.